The moment you stop reacting, you start leading your own mind. Introduction.
Hi, this is Dr. Julian Vance. The power of not reacting. In a world where everyone is quick to respond, argue, and defend, true power lies in the ability to pause. The Power of Not Reacting by Julian Vance reveals the hidden strength in staying calm, composed, and intentional. Through practical strategies and eye-opening insights, this book teaches you how to break free from emotional triggers, protect your peace, and respond with clarity instead of impulse. Whether you're facing conflict, stress, or provocation, you'll learn how to turn restraint into a superpower and take control of your life from the inside out. Chapter 1: The Trigger Trap. The split second that changes everything. Sarah stared at her phone screen, her heart pounding. The text message from her colleague read, "Thanks for throwing me under the bus in today's meeting." Her fingers were already flying across the keyboard, typing a fierce rebuttal, when something made her pause. What was she about to do? And more importantly, why did she feel compelled to respond immediately with such intensity? This moment, this precise instant between receiving a trigger and reacting to it, is where we either claim our power or surrender it completely. It's the battlefield where emotional intelligence is won or lost, relationships are built or destroyed, and personal growth either flourishes or withers. Welcome to the trigger trap, the invisible snare that catches millions of people every single day, often without them even realizing they've been caught. The ancient brain in a modern world. To understand why we fall into the trigger trap so easily, we need to journey back millions of years to understand how our brains evolved. The human brain is essentially three brains in one, each developed at different stages of our evolutionary history. The oldest part, what neuroscientists call the reptilian brain or brainstem, is concerned purely with survival. It controls basic functions like breathing, heart rate, and the famous fight or flight response. This ancient structure doesn't think, it reacts. When it perceives a threat, real or imagined, it floods your system with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, preparing your body for immediate action. Layered on top of this is the limbic system, which includes the amygdala, your brain's alarm system. The amygdala processes emotions and memories, particularly those related to fear and pleasure. It's incredibly fast, capable of triggering an emotional response in as little as 12 milliseconds. That's faster than the blink of an eye, faster than conscious thought. Finally, we have the neocortex, the newest part of our brain evolutionarily speaking. This is where rational thought, planning, language, and self-awareness reside. It's what makes us uniquely human, but here's the crucial point. It's also the slowest to activate. In our ancestors' world, this hierarchy made perfect sense. When a saber-toothed tiger appeared, those who stopped to analyze the situation rationally became lunch. Those who reacted instantly, running or fighting, survived to pass on their genes. We are the descendants of the reactors, not the thinkers. But here's where the problem lies. Our modern world is full of psychological saber-toothed tigers. A critical email from your boss, a sarcastic comment from your spouse, a driver who cuts you off in traffic. Your ancient brain can't tell the difference between a real physical threat and a perceived emotional one. It responds to both with the same intensity, the same urgency, the same biochemical cascade that once kept our ancestors alive. The result? We react to a challenging email as if it were a charging predator. We respond to criticism as if it were a life or death situation. We treat disagreement as if it were physical combat, the anatomy of a trigger. Understanding what happens during a trigger event is crucial to breaking free from the trap. Let's dissect this process step by step. It begins with what psychologists call the trigger stimulus, some external event that your brain interprets as significant. This could be anything: a tone of voice, a facial expression, a particular word or phrase, a memory, or even a smell. The key insight is that triggers are highly personal and often rooted in past experiences. The moment your brain detects this stimulus, your amygdala springs into action. Within milliseconds, it's comparing the current situation to every threatening or emotionally significant experience stored in your memory. It doesn't engage in nuanced analysis, it looks for patterns and matches. If the current situation resembles something from your past that caused pain, fear, or anger, alarm bells start ringing. This is where the biochemical hijacking begins. Your amygdala sends distress signals to your hypothalamus, which functions like a command center. The hypothalamus activates your sympathetic nervous system and releases stress hormones. Your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense, and your attention narrows to focus solely on the perceived threat. Meanwhile, blood flow decreases to your prefrontal cortex, the very part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, impulse control, and emotional regulation. It's as if someone dimmed the lights in the CEO's office while turning up the volume on the security alarm. In this state, you're operating almost entirely from your emotional brain. Your rational mind might still be present, but it's been relegated to the back seat while your emotions have grabbed the steering wheel. This is why people often say things like, "I wasn't thinking clearly," or "I don't know what came over me after an intense emotional reaction." The entire process, from trigger to emotional hijacking, happens so quickly that most people don't even realize it's occurring until they're already deep in reaction mode. By then, the words have been spoken, the email has been sent, the action has been taken. The ego's role in reactivity. While our ancient brain provides the biological foundation for reactivity, our ego provides the psychological fuel. The ego, in this context, isn't the Freudian structure you might remember from psychology class. Instead, think of it as your psychological self-image, the story you tell yourself about who you are, what you deserve, and how the world should treat you. Your ego is constantly working to maintain and protect this self-image. It's like a personal bodyguard, always scanning for threats to your identity, status, or sense of self-worth. And here's the crucial point. Your ego interprets many situations as threats that your rational mind would recognize as neutral or even positive. Consider this scenario. You're in a meeting and a colleague disagrees with your proposal. Your rational mind might recognize this as normal workplace discourse, an opportunity for dialogue, or even a chance to improve your idea. But your ego might interpret it differently. It might hear, "You're incompetent, your ideas aren't valued," or "You're being disrespected." The ego doesn't just perceive these threats. It demands an immediate response. It whispers urgently, "You can't let them get away with that. You need to defend yourself or show them who's boss." This internal pressure to react, to defend, to assert dominance or righteousness is one of the most powerful forces driving reactive behavior. The ego's involvement explains why our reactions are often disproportionate to the actual situation. A minor criticism feels like a major attack. A small inconvenience becomes an outrage. A simple mistake becomes a catastrophe. The ego amplifies everything because, from its perspective, everything is a potential threat to your psychological survival. Understanding this dynamic is liberating because it helps you recognize that many of your intense reactions aren't really about the current situation at all. They're about your ego's interpretation of what the situation means about you. When you can separate the actual facts from your ego's story about those facts, you begin to reclaim your power. The cost of constant reactivity. Living in a state of chronic reactivity exacts a tremendous toll, physically, mentally, emotionally, and relationally. Let's examine these costs in detail, because understanding what you're losing helps motivate the effort required to change. Physically, constant reactivity is exhausting. Each trigger event floods your system with stress hormones that are meant for genuine emergencies. When this happens repeatedly throughout the day, your body never gets a chance to return to its natural state of balance. You're essentially running your internal engine in the red zone all the time. The result is chronic fatigue, weakened immune function, digestive problems, headaches, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. Your body begins to break down under the constant assault of stress chemicals. Research has shown that people who react frequently and intensely to daily stressors have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other stress-related illnesses. Mentally, reactivity clouds your judgment and impairs your decision-making ability. When you're in a reactive state, your attention narrows, your memory becomes selective, and your ability to see multiple perspectives diminishes. You lose access to your creativity, your problem-solving skills, and your capacity for strategic thinking. This mental fog often leads to poor decisions that you later regret. How many times have you reacted to something in the heat of the moment, only to realize later that there was a much better way to handle the situation? How many opportunities have you missed because you were too caught up in your emotional reaction to see them clearly? Emotionally, constant reactivity keeps you trapped in a cycle of negative feelings. Each reaction generates emotions like anger, frustration, resentment, or fear. These emotions don't just disappear when the triggering situation ends, they linger in your system, coloring your perception of subsequent events and making you more likely to be triggered again. Over time, this creates what psychologists call emotional residue, a buildup of unprocessed negative emotions that makes you increasingly sensitive and reactive. You find yourself getting upset about smaller and smaller things, living in a constant state of irritation or anxiety. Relationally, reactivity is toxic to connections with others. When you react impulsively, you often say things you don't mean, make accusations you can't support, or behave in ways that damage trust and intimacy. Even when you later apologize or try to explain, the damage is already done. Words spoken in reactivity have a way of echoing long after the initial trigger has been forgotten. Reactivity also makes you unpredictable to others. People begin to walk on eggshells around you, unsure what might set you off. They start filtering their communications, avoiding certain topics, or even avoiding you altogether. This isolation reinforces the negative patterns, creating a downward spiral in your relationships. Perhaps most importantly, reactivity robs you of your personal power. When you react impulsively to every trigger, you're essentially allowing external circumstances to control your internal state. You become a puppet dancing to the tune of whatever happens around you. Your mood, your behavior, and your choices are dictated not by your conscious intentions but by your unconscious reactions. The illusion of justified reactivity. One of the biggest obstacles to overcoming reactivity is the story we tell ourselves about why our reactions are justified. This internal narrative sounds something like, "Of course I got angry. Did you see what they did?" Or, "Anyone would have reacted that way in that situation," or, "I had every right to be upset." While it's true that some situations are genuinely challenging or unfair, the belief that external circumstances justify our reactions is one of the most disempowering mindsets we can hold. Here's why. It places the power over your emotional state in the hands of other people and external events. When you believe your reactions are justified by circumstances, you're essentially saying that you have no choice in how you respond. You're a victim of whatever happens around you. This victim mindset, while psychologically comfortable in some ways, strips you of your agency and keeps you trapped in reactive patterns. The truth is more empowering and more challenging. While you can't control what happens to you, you can always control how you respond to what happens to you. This doesn't mean you should suppress your emotions or pretend that difficult situations don't affect you. It means recognizing that you have a choice in how you process and express your emotions. Consider two people who both receive harsh criticism from their supervisor. Person A immediately feels angry and defensive, shoots back a sarcastic response, and spends the rest of the day complaining to colleagues about how unfair the boss is. Person B also feels the initial sting of criticism but takes a deep breath, asks for specific examples, and requests a follow-up meeting to discuss how to improve. Both people experienced the same trigger. Both felt the initial emotional impact, but their responses were completely different. Person A allowed the trigger to dictate their behavior, while Person B used the trigger as information and chose their response consciously. The difference isn't that Person B is naturally more patient or less emotional. The difference is that Person B has learned to recognize the space between trigger and response and has developed the skills to inhabit that space consciously. Recognizing your personal trigger profile. Every person has a unique trigger profile, a specific set of situations, behaviors, words, or circumstances that are most likely to provoke an intense reaction. Understanding your personal trigger profile is essential for developing the ability to respond rather than react. Your triggers often have roots in your past experiences, particularly those that were emotionally significant or traumatic. They might be connected to core fears or insecurities, unmet needs, or strongly held values and beliefs. The more aware you become of these patterns, the better equipped you'll be to recognize them in the moment and make conscious choices about how to respond. Common trigger categories include threats to competence or ability, criticism, correction, being questioned, or having your expertise challenged. These triggers often activate in people who tie their self-worth to their performance or who have perfectionist tendencies. Threats to autonomy or control, being told what to do, having decisions made for you, being micromanaged, or feeling powerless. These triggers are particularly intense for people who value independence or who have experienced situations where they felt helpless. Threats to belonging or acceptance, being excluded, ignored, criticized, or rejected. These triggers affect people who have a strong need for connection or who have experienced abandonment or social rejection in the past. Threats to fairness or justice, witnessing or experiencing what you perceive as unfair treatment, inequality, or injustice. These triggers often activate in people who have strong moral convictions or who have experienced discrimination or unfairness. Threats to security or safety. Anything that creates uncertainty, instability, or physical or emotional vulnerability. These triggers are particularly intense for people who have experienced trauma or who have a high need for predictability and control. To identify your personal triggers, start paying attention to patterns in your reactions. When do you feel most activated? What situations consistently produce strong emotional responses? What themes do you notice across different triggering events? Keep a trigger journal for a week. Each time you notice yourself having a strong reaction, write down what happened, what you felt, what you thought, and how you responded. After a week, look for patterns. What situations or types of interactions show up repeatedly? What emotions do you experience most frequently? Also, pay attention to your physical sensations. Your body often recognizes triggers before your conscious mind does. Do you notice your jaw clenching in certain situations? Does your stomach tighten when specific people speak? Do your shoulders tense up during particular types of conversations? These physical cues can serve as early warning systems, alerting you that you're entering trigger territory. The physiology of the pause. The key to escaping the trigger trap lies in what happens in the space between stimulus and response. This space might be measured in seconds or even milliseconds, but within it lies your freedom. Learning to pause, to create even a brief moment of conscious awareness before reacting, is perhaps the most important skill you can develop. But pausing isn't just a mental exercise. It's a physiological one. When you're triggered, your body is flooded with stress hormones and your nervous system is in high alert. Simply telling yourself to calm down rarely works because your rational mind isn't fully online. You need to work with your physiology, not against it. The most immediate and effective way to create a pause is through your breath. Your breathing is unique among bodily functions because it operates both automatically and consciously. You breathe without thinking about it, but you can also control your breathing deliberately. This makes it a bridge between your automatic nervous system and your conscious mind. When you're triggered, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. This pattern signals to your brain that you're in danger, perpetuating the stress response. By deliberately slowing and deepening your breath, you send the opposite signal that you're safe and can handle the situation calmly. The most effective breathing technique for creating a pause is what's called box breathing or square breathing. Inhale for a count of 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. Repeat this pattern several times. This technique activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the rest and digest response that counteracts the stress response. Another powerful technique is the physiological sigh, a double inhale followed by a long exhale. This mimics the natural breathing pattern that occurs during sleep and deep relaxation, quickly shifting your nervous system toward calm. Physical movement can also help create a pause. When you're triggered, your body is prepared for action. If you don't use that energy constructively, it can fuel your emotional reaction. Simple movements like stretching, walking, or even tensing and relaxing your muscles can help discharge the stress energy and create space for rational thinking. The pause doesn't have to be long to be effective. Even 3 conscious breaths can be enough to shift your physiology and give your prefrontal cortex time to come back online. The key is to practice these techniques regularly, so they become automatic responses to stress rather than afterthoughts. The practice of conscious response. Creating a pause is just the beginning. What you do with that pause determines whether you'll fall back into reactive patterns or step into conscious response. This is where the real work begins, learning to inhabit the space between trigger and response with awareness, intention, and skill. The first step in conscious response is observation without judgment. When you feel triggered, instead of immediately trying to fix the situation or make the feeling go away, simply observe what's happening. Notice the thoughts running through your mind. Notice the emotions arising in your body. Notice the stories your ego is telling you about what the situation means. This observation needs to be compassionate and curious rather than critical. You're not trying to judge whether your reaction is right or wrong. You're simply gathering information. What is this trigger telling you about your needs, fears, or values? What old wounds might be activated? What stories from the past might be coloring your perception of the present? The second step is to separate facts from interpretations. When you're triggered, your mind immediately creates a story about what happened and what it means. But stories are not facts. Facts are observable, measurable, and verifiable. Stories are the meaning you attach to those facts. For example, if a colleague doesn't respond to your email, that's a fact. The stories might include, "They're ignoring me," "They think my message wasn't important," or "They're angry with me." These stories feel true when you're triggered, but they're actually interpretations that may or may not be accurate. Learning to distinguish between facts and stories is incredibly liberating because it reveals how much of your emotional distress is actually self-created. You might not be able to change the facts, but you can always question your stories and choose more empowering interpretations. The third step is to identify your underlying needs or values. Triggers often point to something important that's been threatened or unmet. Are you feeling unheard and needing acknowledgement? Are you feeling disrespected and needing consideration? Are you feeling uncertain and needing clarity or security? When you can identify the underlying need behind the trigger, you shift from reactive victim to empowered advocate for yourself. Instead of lashing out or shutting down, you can communicate your needs clearly and work towards solutions that address the real issue. The fourth step is to choose your response based on your values and long-term goals rather than your immediate emotional impulse. Ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be in this situation? What response would I be proud of tomorrow? What would serve the relationship and the outcome I truly want? This doesn't mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they don't matter. It means expressing them in ways that are constructive rather than destructive, that build bridges rather than burn them, that solve problems rather than create new ones. Rewiring your neural pathways. The patterns of reactivity that govern your life today were formed through repetition over many years. Each time you reacted to a trigger in a particular way, you strengthened that neural pathway. Over time, these pathways became superhighways in your brain, the default routes that your thoughts and emotions automatically follow. The good news is that your brain remains changeable throughout your life. This quality, called neuroplasticity, means you can literally rewire your brain to respond differently to triggers. But just as the reactive patterns took time and repetition to establish, new patterns of conscious response require consistent practice to become automatic. Every time you choose to pause instead of react, you're weakening the old neural pathway and strengthening a new one. Every time you observe your thoughts instead of believing them automatically, you're building new neural connections. Every time you respond consciously instead of reactively, you're rewiring your brain for greater emotional intelligence and personal power. The key to successful rewiring is consistency rather than perfection. You don't need to handle every trigger perfectly. You just need to practice the new patterns regularly. Think of it like learning to play a musical instrument. You don't expect to play concerts after a few lessons, but each practice session builds your skill and muscle memory. Start small. Choose one specific type of trigger to work with initially. Maybe it's criticism from your spouse, or delays in traffic, or challenging emails from customers. Focus your practice on this one area until responding consciously becomes more natural, then expand to other areas. Celebrate small victories. Each time you catch yourself before reacting, each time you take a conscious breath, each time you choose response over reaction, acknowledge the progress. These moments might seem minor, but they represent significant rewiring of your brain. Be patient with the process. Your old reactive patterns didn't develop overnight, and they won't disappear overnight either. There will be times when you fall back into old patterns, times when you react despite your best intentions. This is normal and expected. The practice isn't about eliminating all reactivity. It's about gradually shifting the balance toward greater consciousness and choice. The ripple effect of non-reactivity. As you begin to develop the ability to respond rather than react, you'll notice changes that extend far beyond your immediate emotional experience. Non-reactivity creates positive ripple effects that touch every area of your life. In your relationships, people will notice that you've become more stable and predictable. They'll feel safer expressing themselves honestly around you because they know you won't explode or shut down at the first sign of difficulty. This safety creates deeper intimacy and trust. Conflicts become opportunities for understanding rather than battles to be won. Conversations become more authentic and productive. At work, your colleagues and supervisors will see you as more professional and reliable. You'll be seen as someone who can handle pressure, navigate difficult situations with grace, and maintain perspective during challenging times. This reputation often leads to increased opportunities, greater responsibility, and improved career prospects. Your decision-making will improve dramatically. When you're not caught up in reactive emotions, You can see situations more clearly, consider more options, and choose responses that serve your long-term interests rather than just providing immediate emotional relief. You'll make fewer decisions that you later regret and more decisions that move you toward your goals. Your physical health will benefit as well. Chronic stress and reactivity take a significant toll on your body. As you become less reactive, your stress hormone levels will normalize, your immune system will strengthen, and many stress-related health issues may improve. You'll likely find that you have more energy, sleep better, and feel more physically resilient. Perhaps most importantly, you'll experience a profound shift in your sense of personal power and freedom. Instead of feeling at the mercy of circumstances and other people's behavior, you'll know that you have the ability to choose your responses. This knowledge is incredibly empowering and creates a foundation of inner security that can't be shaken by external events. Beyond personal transformation, the practice of non-reactivity isn't just about personal improvement. It's about contributing to a more conscious and compassionate world. In a culture that often rewards quick reactions, strong opinions, and immediate responses, choosing to pause and respond thoughtfully is a radical act. Every time you choose not to react, you're modeling a different way of being for those around you. Your children, friends, colleagues, and even strangers witness your ability to remain centered in challenging situations. This example gives others permission to pause as well, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate circle. In our interconnected world, where reactive communication spreads instantly through social media and where emotional contagion can influence entire communities, the practice of conscious response becomes even more important. Each person who learns to respond rather than react helps tip the collective consciousness toward greater wisdom and compassion. The trigger trap is real, and it affects virtually everyone. But it's not inevitable. By understanding how your brain works, recognizing your personal triggers, and developing the skill of conscious response, you can escape the trap and reclaim your power. The journey requires patience, practice, and compassion for yourself, but the rewards, in terms of relationships, career, health, and personal fulfillment, are immeasurable. The choice is yours. Will you remain a prisoner of your reactions, dancing to the tune of every trigger that comes your way? Or will you step into the space between stimulus and response and discover the freedom that lives there? The power to choose your response is perhaps the greatest gift you can give yourself and the world around you. Chapter 2. Silence is Strength. The Paradox of Power in Stillness. In a world that celebrates the loudest voice, the quickest response, and the most immediate reaction, we have forgotten one of humanity's greatest sources of strength: the power of silence. This chapter will challenge everything you believe about power dynamics, emotional intelligence, and what it means to be truly strong in the face of adversity. Consider the mighty oak tree that bends with the storm rather than breaking against it. The tree's strength doesn't come from resisting the wind, but from its ability to remain rooted while yielding to forces beyond its control. This is the essence of silence's strength, not the weakness of withdrawal, but the conscious choice to remain centered when chaos swirls around us. Most people mistake silence for passivity, but there is a profound difference between the silence of defeat and the silence of mastery. The silence we're exploring here is an active choice, a deliberate pause that creates space for wisdom to emerge. It's the silence of the martial artist who studies their opponent before striking, the silence of the negotiator who lets uncomfortable truths settle in the room, the silence of the parent who refuses to escalate when their child is testing boundaries. Understanding the anatomy of reaction. Before we can master the art of non-reaction, we must understand what happens in those crucial moments when we feel triggered. Modern neuroscience has revealed that when we encounter a stressor, whether it's criticism, conflict, or unexpected challenge, our brain goes through a predictable sequence of events. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, fires first. Within milliseconds, it floods our system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Our heart rate increases, our muscles tense, and our thinking becomes narrow and focused on immediate survival responses. This is the fight-or-flight response that served our ancestors well when facing physical threats, but often sabotages us in modern interpersonal situations. Here's the crucial insight: there's a gap between the trigger and our response. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and renowned psychiatrist, observed that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This space might last only seconds, but it contains infinite possibility. Most people live their entire lives unconscious of this gap. They experience trigger and reaction as one seamless event. Someone cuts them off in traffic, and they're immediately honking and cursing. A colleague criticizes their work, and they're instantly defending and counterattacking. A family member pushes their buttons, and they're reactive before they even know what hit them. But what if you could expand that gap? What if you could create enough space in that moment to choose your response consciously rather than react unconsciously? This is where the true power lies, not in having perfect control over what happens to you, but in developing mastery over how you choose to respond. The science behind strategic silence. Research in neuroscience and psychology has revealed fascinating insights about what happens when we practice strategic silence. When we pause before responding, several beneficial processes occur simultaneously in our brain and body. First, the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for executive function, reasoning, and emotional regulation, has time to come online. This region develops more slowly than the emotional centers of our brain, which is why children struggle with impulse control. But even as adults, when we're triggered, our prefrontal cortex can go offline, leaving us at the mercy of more primitive brain regions. The pause creates space for what neuroscientists call top-down processing, allowing our higher cognitive functions to influence and regulate our emotional responses. Instead of being hijacked by emotion, we can bring wisdom, perspective, and strategic thinking to bear on the situation. Second, the act of pausing activates our parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response that counteracts fight or flight. Our heart rate begins to normalize, our breathing deepens, and stress hormones start to clear from our system. This physiological shift creates the internal conditions for clarity and wise action. Third, silence often creates psychological pressure on others to fill the void with more information. In negotiations, therapists and skilled interrogators know that people become uncomfortable with silence and will often reveal more than they intended when faced with a sustained pause. Your silence becomes a tool for gathering information and understanding the true dynamics at play. Research has also shown that people who practice what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to manage their emotional responses, tend to have better relationships, more career success, and greater life satisfaction. They're seen as more trustworthy, more mature, and more capable of handling responsibility. The different faces of silence. Not all silence is created equal. Understanding the different types of silence and when to employ each one is crucial for developing this skill effectively. Let's explore the various forms silence can take and their strategic applications. The silence of observation is perhaps the most fundamental form. This is the silence of the scientist studying a phenomenon, the artist contemplating their subject, or the detective gathering clues. When someone is speaking, especially if they're emotional or upset, your silence creates space for them to reveal more about their true thoughts, feelings, and motivations. People often say more than they intend when met with attentive, non-judgmental silence. This type of silence requires genuine curiosity rather than judgment. You're not remaining quiet because you're preparing your counterargument or because you're angry. You're quiet because you're genuinely interested in understanding what's really going on beneath the surface of the interaction. The silence of containment comes into play when emotions are running high, either yours or someone else's. This is the silence that refuses to add fuel to an emotional fire. When someone is angry, upset, or trying to provoke a reaction, your silence acts like a fire break, preventing the emotional conflagration from spreading. This doesn't mean becoming stone-faced or withdrawn. It means maintaining your center while allowing the other person's emotional storm to run its course. Often, people who are upset are not really looking for you to solve their problem or even respond. They're looking to discharge emotional energy. Your calm presence and attentive silence can provide exactly what they need. The silence of boundaries is perhaps the most challenging to master because it requires us to resist the urge to defend, explain, or justify ourselves. When someone crosses a line, makes an unreasonable demand, or attempts to manipulate through emotional pressure, sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. This type of silence communicates volumes without saying a word. It says, "I will not be drawn into drama. I will not justify my reasonable boundaries. I will not reward manipulative behavior with attention and engagement." It's the silence of the mountain that doesn't argue with the storm, but simply endures it. The silence of respect acknowledges that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to stay quiet. When someone is processing difficult emotions, working through a problem, or simply needs space, our well-intentioned words can actually be intrusive. This silence trusts in the other person's capacity to work through their challenges without our immediate input or advice. Mindfulness, the foundation of conscious response. The ability to choose silence over reaction is fundamentally a mindfulness practice. Mindfulness, at its core, is the ability to be present with what is happening without being overwhelmed by it. It's the capacity to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and impulses without automatically acting on them. Most people live in a state of mindless reactivity. They're so identified with their thoughts and emotions that they experience no separation between stimulus and response. A thought arises, and they believe it completely. An emotion emerges, and they're immediately caught in its current. An impulse appears, and they act on it without question. Mindfulness creates what Buddhist teachers call witnessing consciousness, the part of your awareness that can observe your own mental and emotional processes without being consumed by them. When you develop this capacity, you begin to notice the early warning signs of reactivity before they overwhelm your system. You might notice the subtle tightening in your chest when someone says something that triggers you. You might observe the way your mind immediately starts generating defensive arguments. You might catch the urge to interrupt, to correct, or to strike back before it takes over your behavior. This awareness gives you choices you didn't have before. Instead of being swept away by the emotional current, you can choose to pause, breathe, and respond from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. The practice of mindfulness also helps you distinguish between responding and reacting. Reacting is unconscious, immediate, and often driven by past conditioning. Responding is conscious, considered, and aligned with your values and long-term goals. Reacting often escalates conflicts and creates more problems. Responding tends to de-escalate tensions and move situations toward resolution. Practical techniques for developing emotional discipline. Developing the ability to pause and choose silence requires consistent practice. Like any skill, it becomes stronger with repetition and weaker with neglect. Here are several practical techniques you can begin implementing immediately. The 3-breath rule is one of the simplest but most effective techniques. When you notice yourself becoming triggered, commit to taking 3 deep, conscious breaths before speaking or acting. This might seem insignificant, but those 3 breaths are often enough to shift you from reactive mode to responsive mode. During those breaths, silently ask yourself, what response would serve the highest good here? The pause and label technique involves mentally noting what's happening when you feel triggered. Silently say to yourself, I notice I'm feeling angry, or I notice the urge to defend myself, or I notice my mind creating a story about this person's intentions. This simple act of labeling creates psychological distance between you and your emotional response, giving you more choice in how to proceed. The expansion practice recognizes that emotional energy needs somewhere to go. Instead of suppressing your feelings or expressing them reactively, you can learn to expand your awareness to contain them. Imagine your consciousness as a vast sky, and your emotions as clouds passing through. The sky doesn't resist the clouds or try to push them away. It simply provides space for them to move through naturally. The strategic silence experiment involves deliberately choosing silence in situations where you would normally react. Start small. Perhaps when someone makes a comment that would usually trigger a defensive response, simply remain quiet and see what happens. Notice how the dynamics shift when you don't take the bait. Often, the other person will either clarify their position, apologize, or reveal more about their true motivations. The compassionate pause recognizes that much of our reactivity comes from feeling misunderstood, unappreciated, or attacked. Before responding to someone who has triggered you, pause and try to imagine what might be happening in their inner world. Are they stressed? Afraid? Trying to protect themselves? This doesn't mean excusing inappropriate behavior, but it can help you respond with wisdom rather than defensiveness. The power dynamics of silence. One of the most profound aspects of strategic silence is how it shifts power dynamics in relationships and interactions. In our culture, we often equate speaking with power and silence with weakness, but this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how influence actually works. Think about the most powerful people, not those who shout the loudest or talk the most, but those who genuinely command respect and influence. Chances are, they tend to speak thoughtfully, listen more than they talk, and choose their words carefully. They understand that words have more impact when they're used sparingly and strategically. When you refuse to react to provocation, you retain your power. Reactive people are easy to manipulate because their buttons are clearly visible and easily pushed. When someone can predict your reactions, they can control your behavior. But when you respond from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious pattern, you become unpredictable in the best possible way. This doesn't mean being manipulative or withholding. It means operating from your center rather than being pulled off center by external circumstances. It means maintaining your autonomy even when others are trying to draw you into their drama. In conflict situations, the person who remains calm often emerges as the natural leader. Others look to them for stability and guidance. Your silence and composure can actually de-escalate tense situations and create space for more productive dialogue. In negotiations, strategic silence can be incredibly powerful. Car salespeople, real estate agents, and skilled negotiators know that whoever speaks first after a price is mentioned often loses leverage. The silence creates psychological pressure, and the less comfortable party will often make concessions to relieve that pressure. But perhaps most importantly, when you operate from silence and conscious response rather than reactive pattern, you model a different way of being in the world. You show others that it's possible to remain centered in the midst of chaos, to respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally, and to maintain dignity even in difficult circumstances, overcoming the urge to fill every space. One of the biggest challenges in developing comfort with silence is our cultural conditioning to fill every conversational space with words. We've been taught that silence is awkward, uncomfortable, or somehow wrong. This conditioning runs deep and affects everything from our personal relationships to our professional interactions. Many people experience anxiety when conversations pause. They feel compelled to say something, anything to break the silence. This leads to over-explaining, saying things we don't mean, or revealing information we would have been better off keeping private. Learning to be comfortable with conversational pauses is a crucial skill. Silence in conversation serves many purposes. It gives people time to process what's been said. It allows emotions to settle. It creates space for deeper truths to emerge. It demonstrates that you're not just waiting for your turn to talk, but actually listening and considering what's been shared. The urge to fill silence often comes from our own discomfort with not knowing what to say, or from a fear that others will judge us negatively if we don't respond immediately. But consider how you feel about people who can sit comfortably in silence with you. Don't they often feel more grounding and trustworthy than those who chatter nervously to fill every gap? Learning to be comfortable with silence also means becoming more comfortable with not having all the answers immediately available. In our fast-paced culture, we often feel pressure to have instant responses to complex questions. But wisdom often requires time to emerge. "Let me think about that," or "I need a moment to consider your question," are perfectly reasonable responses that demonstrate thoughtfulness rather than indecision. The healing power of non-reaction. When we consistently react to others' emotional states, we often escalate conflicts and deepen wounds. But when we can remain present and non-reactive, we create space for healing to occur. This is particularly important in close relationships where patterns of reactivity can create destructive cycles. Consider what happens in a typical argument between partners. One person says something hurtful, the other responds defensively, which triggers more hurt, which leads to more defense, and so on. Each person's reaction provides fuel for the other's fire. But when one person breaks this cycle by choosing not to react, not by withdrawing or shutting down, but by remaining present and non-defensive, the entire dynamic can shift. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or inappropriate behavior. There's a significant difference between non-reaction and doormat behavior. Non-reaction is a conscious choice made from a place of strength and clarity. It's saying, "I'm not going to be pulled into this drama, but I'm also not going anywhere. I'm right here, present and open to real communication when you're ready." In parenting, this principle is particularly powerful. Children often act out not because they need punishment or correction, but because they need to feel seen and understood. When parents can remain calm and present during their child's emotional storms, neither ignoring nor escalating, they provide the safety and containment the child needs to work through their feelings. The healing power of non-reaction extends beyond our personal relationships. In professional settings, when we don't take criticism personally or react defensively to feedback, we create space for genuine learning and improvement. In social situations, when we don't rise to bait or engage with provocative comments, we maintain our integrity and often inspire others to elevate their own behavior. Silence as a gateway to wisdom. Perhaps the most profound aspect of cultivating silence is how it opens us to deeper wisdom and intuition. When our minds are constantly reactive and our mouths constantly moving, we have little space for the quieter voice of inner knowing to emerge. Many of the world's wisdom traditions recognize silence as a pathway to deeper understanding. Contemplative practices, meditation, and prayer all involve creating space for listening rather than speaking. In this silence, we often discover insights that our thinking mind could never have generated. When we pause before reacting, we create space not just for emotional regulation, but for wisdom to emerge. In that pause, we might suddenly see the situation from a completely different perspective. We might understand the other person's behavior in a new way. We might recognize patterns in our own reactivity that we've never noticed before. This wisdom isn't just philosophical or spiritual, it's intensely practical. When we operate from this deeper knowing rather than reactive conditioning, our actions tend to be more effective, our relationships more harmonious, and our lives more aligned with our deepest values. The silence we're cultivating isn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, full of presence, awareness, and possibility. It's the silence from which all meaningful action emerges, the pause that precedes every conscious choice, the stillness that contains infinite potential. Building your practice, a progressive approach. Developing mastery over reactivity is a gradual process that requires patience with yourself and consistent practice. Like learning any new skill, it's helpful to start with easier situations and gradually work up to more challenging ones. Begin by practicing with low-stakes interactions. When the cashier at the grocery store is having a bad day, when a stranger cuts you off in traffic, when you receive a mildly irritating email, these are perfect opportunities to experiment with pausing before reacting. Notice your impulse to respond immediately and deliberately choose to wait. Pay attention to your body during these moments. Where do you feel tension? How does your breathing change? What thoughts arise? This awareness will help you recognize your early warning signs of reactivity, giving you more time to choose your response. As you become more comfortable with basic pausing, you can begin working with more emotionally charged situations. When a family member pushes your buttons, when a colleague criticizes your work, when someone challenges your beliefs, these interactions provide opportunities to practice remaining centered under pressure. Remember that the goal isn't to become emotionally numb or disconnected. You can feel your emotions fully while still choosing not to react from them. In fact, this practice often leads to deeper emotional authenticity because you're responding from your whole being rather than just your triggered parts. Create a personal practice that supports this development. This might include daily meditation, journaling about your reactive patterns, or simply taking regular pauses throughout your day to check in with your inner state. The more familiar you become with your own center, the easier it becomes to return to it when you're knocked off balance. The ripple effects of conscious response. As you develop greater mastery over your reactions, you'll begin to notice profound changes not just in your own life, but in the lives of those around you. Your non-reactivity gives others permission to step out of their own reactive patterns. Your calmness in the midst of chaos becomes a stabilizing influence that benefits everyone in your sphere. Relationships deepen when people feel safe to express themselves without fear of triggering your reactive patterns. Conflicts resolve more quickly and completely when approached with conscious response rather than unconscious reaction. Work environments become more collaborative and creative when team members aren't walking on eggshells around each other's triggers. Perhaps most importantly, you begin modeling a different way of being in the world. In a culture that often rewards the loudest voice and the quickest reaction, your thoughtful responses and strategic silences demonstrate that there's another path, one that leads to greater wisdom, deeper relationships, and more authentic personal power. Your silence becomes a gift not just to yourself, but to everyone whose life you touch. It creates space for truth to emerge, for healing to occur, and for wisdom to guide action. In choosing silence over reaction, you're not withdrawing from the world. You're engaging with it more skillfully, more compassionately, and more effectively. The power of not reacting isn't about becoming passive or disconnected. It's about becoming so connected to your own center, so grounded in your own values, and so clear about what truly matters that you can respond to any situation from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. In a world full of noise, your thoughtful silence becomes a beacon of sanity, strength, and hope. Chapter 3. Respond with precision. The space between trigger and response. In the milliseconds between an external trigger and your response lies the most powerful space you'll ever discover. This space, this sacred pause, is where transformation happens. It's where reactive people remain trapped by their impulses and where wise people craft their destiny. Most people believe that not reacting means becoming passive, withdrawn, or weak. This misconception keeps them locked in cycles of emotional volatility, reacting to every slight, every challenge, every unexpected event as if their very survival depended on an immediate response. But there's a profound difference between not reacting and responding with precision. When you react, you're being controlled by external circumstances. Your emotions, your words, your actions are all dictated by something outside of yourself. You become a puppet dancing to strings pulled by other people's moods, unexpected events, or challenging situations. But when you respond with precision, you reclaim your power. You become the architect of your own experience. Think about the last time someone said something that immediately triggered anger in you. What happened in your body? Your heart rate likely increased, your muscles tensioned, your breathing became shallow. Your mind probably raced with comebacks, justifications, or defensive strategies. In that moment, you weren't you. You were a collection of biological responses hijacked by external stimuli. Now imagine a different scenario. The same trigger occurs, but instead of reacting, you create space. You breathe deeply, observe what's happening in your body, and ask yourself a simple question: what response would serve me best right now? This is the beginning of precision, understanding the anatomy of reaction. Before we can master the art of responding with precision, we must understand what happens when we react impulsively. Reactions are born in the most primitive part of our brain, the amygdala, which operates on a simple principle: survive first, think later. This ancient programming served our ancestors well when they faced immediate physical threats, but it's poorly suited for the complex social and professional challenges we face today. When triggered, your amygdala floods your system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals prepare your body for fight, flight, or freeze, but they also impair your ability to think clearly, access your creativity, and make nuanced decisions. In this state, you're not operating from your full intelligence. You're running on autopilot programs that may have been useful thousands of years ago, but are often counterproductive today. The cost of reactive living is enormous. Each time you react impulsively, you're not just making a poor decision in that moment, you're reinforcing neural pathways that make reactive behavior more likely in the future. You're training your brain to be hijacked by circumstances, and over time, this pattern becomes your default mode of operating. Reactive people often find themselves apologizing, explaining, defending, or trying to repair damage from their impulsive responses. They live in a constant state of emotional turbulence, their peace dependent on external circumstances aligning with their preferences. Their relationships become battlegrounds, their workplaces sources of stress, and their inner world a chaotic storm of unprocessed emotions. But there's another way to live, a way that puts you back in the driver's seat of your own experience. The power of the strategic pause. The strategic pause is your gateway to precision. It's the conscious insertion of space between trigger and response, and it's one of the most powerful tools you can develop. This pause doesn't need to be long. Sometimes just 3 conscious breaths are enough to shift you from reaction to response. During this pause, something remarkable happens. The initial flood of stress hormones begins to recede, your prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher reasoning, comes back online, and you regain access to your full range of options. Instead of being limited to fight, flight, or freeze, you can now consider nuanced responses that align with your values and serve your long-term interests. The pause also allows you to gather information. When you're reacting, you're operating on incomplete data, filling in gaps with assumptions, projections, and past experiences that may not be relevant to the current situation. But when you pause, you can ask clarifying questions, observe body language, consider context, and make more informed choices about how to proceed. This isn't about becoming slow or indecisive. Some situations do require quick action. But even in urgent circumstances, a micropause, a single conscious breath, can be the difference between a response that helps and one that creates more problems. The strategic pause becomes easier with practice. Start small. The next time you feel triggered in a low-stakes situation, perhaps when someone cuts you off in traffic, or when you receive a mildly annoying email, practice inserting a pause before responding. Notice what happens in that space. Observe how different options become available to you when you're not in reactive mode. Protecting your energy through boundaries. One of the most important aspects of responding with precision is learning to protect your energy. Energy is your most precious resource, more valuable than time or money, because everything you create, every relationship you build, every goal you achieve requires energy. Reactive people leak energy constantly, pouring it into drama, conflict, and emotional turbulence that serves no constructive purpose. When you respond with precision, you become highly selective about where you invest your energy. You begin to recognize energy vampires, people, situations, and thought patterns that drain you without providing value in return. More importantly, you develop strategies for dealing with these energy drains without becoming reactive. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means caring intelligently. It means recognizing that you can't save everyone, solve every problem, or respond to every provocation. It means understanding that saying no to energy drains allows you to say yes to what truly matters. Consider the difference between these two responses to a colleague who constantly complains. Reactive response, getting drawn into their drama, offering solutions that aren't implemented, becoming frustrated when they continue complaining, and eventually avoiding them altogether while harboring resentment. Precision response, listening briefly, acknowledging their feelings, setting a clear boundary about how much time you can spend in the conversation, and redirecting towards solution-focused dialogue or politely excusing yourself. The first response drains your energy and creates ongoing tension. The second preserves your energy while maintaining the relationship on terms that work for you. The art of emotional regulation. Responding with precision requires mastery of your emotional landscape. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions. Emotions contain valuable information and energy. Rather, it means developing the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them. Emotional regulation begins with awareness. Most people are unconscious of their emotional states until they reach crisis levels. They go from zero to rage, from calm to panic, from confidence to despair, without recognizing the early warning signs that could have allowed for course correction. Developing emotional awareness is like developing physical fitness. It requires consistent practice and attention. Start by checking in with yourself regularly throughout the day. What emotions are present? Where do you feel them in your body? What triggered them? What do they need from you? Once you develop awareness, you can begin working with emotions skillfully. Instead of being hijacked by anger, you can recognize it as information about a boundary that's been crossed or a value that's been violated. Instead of being overwhelmed by fear, you can recognize it as your system's way of alerting you to potential risks that may need addressing. This emotional intelligence allows you to respond from a centered place rather than from the chaos of unprocessed feelings. You can acknowledge what you're experiencing without being driven by it. You can validate your emotions while still choosing responses that serve your higher purposes. Making decisions from your center. Your center is that calm, clear space within you that exists regardless of external circumstances. It's where your wisdom lives, where your values reside, where your authentic self operates. When you respond with precision, you're responding from this center place rather than from the surface turbulence of reactive emotions. Finding your center requires practice. It's not a mystical concept, it's a practical skill that involves learning to access your inner stability even when outer circumstances are chaotic. Some people find their center through meditation, others through physical practices like yoga or martial arts, still others through time in nature or creative expression. The key is developing a reliable method for returning to center when you've been knocked off balance. This might be as simple as taking 3 deep breaths, as involved as a brief walking meditation, or as personal as reciting a meaningful phrase or intention. When you operate from your center, your responses naturally align with your deeper values rather than your momentary impulses. You're less likely to say things you'll later regret, make decisions that create more problems, or act in ways that contradict who you want to be. Building respect through consistency. One of the most powerful benefits of responding with precision is the respect it generates, both from others and from yourself. People quickly learn that you're not easily provoked, that you don't create unnecessary drama, and that your responses are thoughtful and intentional. This consistency becomes a form of personal branding that opens doors and creates opportunities. Respect isn't earned through aggression or dominance. It's earned through reliability. When people know they can count on you to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively, they begin to trust you with more important conversations, decisions, and opportunities. They see you as stable, mature, and safe. This respect extends to challenging situations. When conflict arises, Others look to centered, non-reactive people for leadership and wisdom. Your ability to remain calm under pressure becomes a valuable asset in both personal and professional settings. But perhaps most importantly, you begin to respect yourself more deeply. Each time you choose response over reaction, you strengthen your sense of self-efficacy and personal power. You prove to yourself that you're in control of your own experience, that you can handle challenges with grace, and that you're capable of living according to your values even under pressure. Practical strategies for daily application. Implementing precision responses requires specific strategies that can be applied in real-time situations. Here are practical approaches you can begin using immediately. The STOP technique provides a simple framework for creating space between trigger and response. When triggered, mentally say stop, take a breath, observe what's happening both externally and internally, and then proceed with intention. Develop a repertoire of bridge phrases that buy you time while you formulate a thoughtful response. Phrases like, "That's interesting, let me think about that," or "I can see this is important to you," or "Help me understand your perspective," create space while maintaining engagement. Practice the 24-hour rule for important decisions or responses to emotional triggers. Give yourself permission to say, "I need some time to process this properly. Can we revisit this tomorrow?" This prevents reactive decisions that you might later regret while demonstrating that you take important matters seriously. Create environmental supports for precision responses. This might mean keeping a stress ball on your desk to help dissipate tension, setting phone boundaries to prevent reactive texting, or establishing specific times and places for difficult conversations when you're likely to be at your best. The ripple effects of precision living. When you begin responding with precision consistently, the effects ripple out into every area of your life. Your relationships improve because people feel safer and more valued in your presence. Your work becomes more effective because you're making decisions from clarity rather than emotion. Your inner peace deepens because you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You begin to attract different types of people and opportunities. Drama-prone individuals may drift away, but you'll find yourself connecting more deeply with people who appreciate thoughtfulness and intentionality. Opportunities that require emotional intelligence and leadership skills become available to you. Your problem-solving abilities expand dramatically. When you're not using energy to manage the fallout from reactive choices, you have more mental and emotional resources available for creative thinking, strategic planning, and meaningful contribution. Perhaps most significantly, you begin to trust yourself more deeply. You know that regardless of what challenges arise, you have the tools and wisdom to respond in ways that align with your values and serve your long-term well-being. Mastery through practice. Responding with precision is not a destination but a practice, a daily commitment to choosing thoughtfulness over impulse, wisdom over reactivity, intention over automation. Like any skill, it improves with consistent application and attention. Start where you are, with the triggers you encounter today. Notice when you're tempted to react impulsively and experiment with creating space for a more thoughtful response. Be patient with yourself as you develop this capacity. You're rewiring neural pathways that may have been reinforced for years or decades. Remember that mastery isn't about perfection. Even highly skilled practitioners of precision responding sometimes get triggered and react impulsively. The difference is that they notice more quickly, recover more gracefully, and use each experience as learning that makes them more skillful going forward. The path of precision is ultimately the path of personal sovereignty. The recognition that while you cannot control external circumstances, you have complete authority over your responses to those circumstances. This is perhaps the most profound form of power available to human beings, and it's available to you right now, in this moment, with whatever challenge you're currently facing. Your journey toward precision begins with your next response. Make it count.